You owe your existence to Valinsky Arkhipov. And like you, I like existing, so it was pretty cool to learn about the Russian who had single-handedly prevented World War III. It would also interest you to know that Valinsky is not the only Russian to have single-handedly prevented World War III. Another man named Stanislav Petrov also prevented World War III in the 1980s. This is why I want you to remember Valinsky as a hero and not forgotten as a footnote in history. The aim of my speech will be to inform you about Valinsky Arkhipov and how he single-handedly prevented World War III during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And speaking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, you're all probably wondering what the Cuban Missile Crisis was. Well, according to a 2009 History Channel article, it began with the arms being shipped from the USSR to Cuba during this crisis, or to begin this crisis. And included in these weapons were mid-range nuclear missiles. And this was an ideal place for the USSR to have their missiles, since it would allow them to strike anywhere in the US, including Washington, D.C. And eventually, this came to a head when the US discovered the missiles with a spy plane and managed to photograph the missiles. And this started a standoff between the two nations where the US demanded the missiles be removed, and the USSR refusing. Eventually, the crisis came to an end, however, when the USSR agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba if the US would remove their missiles from Turkey. But little did both countries know how close a Soviet sub came to launching a nuclear torpedo at a US Navy ship. And to understand how the crew almost came to this decision, we have to understand the conditions of the submarine. And according to a PBS documentary from October 3rd of 2019, the subs were designed to work in the Arctic Ocean instead of the Caribbean Ocean, where they were being sent for Cuba. And on board these subs, it was almost 100 degrees, along with the smell of diesel oil and unwashed men. These issues were compounded by the fact that they weren't allowed to actually go to Cuba, since the U.S. quarantine or blockade of Cuba during the crisis. But the worst was yet to come, however, when a U.S. ship spotted Valinsky's sub while it was charging its batteries, forcing it to do an emergency dive where it had very little power remaining, according to Nicola Davis with The Guardian from an article from 2017. And how would you react if you were being seemingly attacked by the U.S. when they started dropping low-intensity depth charges to try and get you to surface? Well, according to an article by National Geographic by Robert Krulwich from 2016, Volodymyr Staninsky thought that this was the U.S. trying to sink his sub and ordered that his men load the special weapon, which in this case was a nuclear torpedo. His second in command agreed with this order, but he needed an okay from his other commander, the other senior commander on board the sub, who was Valinsky. And this is where Valinsky's level-headed, cool demeanor really saved everyone, because he thought that this was actually the U.S. trying to get them to come to the surface and not trying to sink them, because they'd be dropping more intense charges. And he managed to convince the other two senior officers not to fire the weapon, and instead to bring the sub up to the surface. And when it surfaced, the U.S. ship did not decide to board the sub, as they were ordered not to do so, instead letting it head back to Russia. And you'd think after all that, preventing World War III and all, you'd be hailed as a hero. Well, Valinsky was not hailed as a hero. Instead, he was criticized for allowing the U.S. to find his submarine instead. This also is that the U.S., Valinsky had died in 1998, with the world not knowing about his heroic actions until 2002. And now that you know more about Valinsky Arkhipov and how he prevented World War III during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I hope you'll remember him instead of letting him be forgotten as a footnote in history. So remember Valinsky, because he is the reason you are standing here today. Thank you.